We would like to hear from the audience, but I thought we would have a little bit of a discussion among the panelists. And maybe I'll start out by asking each of the panelists slightly different questions. But Jarmar, have you found in your concerns, the bad and the not so bad, that you have any allies within the larger lab or within the institute that you are part of? That is to say, are there senior people who are able to speak to the value of the work that you are doing that could then go into your portfolio as part of your tenure review going forward?
So
is your mic on?
I am very fortunate that my scientific director has a very similar mentality. I have to admit that the whole dilemma with the not replicating that thing for so long made me not want to do it anymore. And the main reason we're putting together this paper highlighting what went wrong is because she pushed me into understanding why this was so important to share. As a tenure track, I'm thinking I don't want to dedicate any more of my resources to this. I just want to get the bigger stories out. I don't want to focus on this anymore. So the answer is yes. I do have people in the senior community that care about this and will speak to that. But at the same time, the senior people are also pushing me to get all the other papers out, and you get this conflicting, you have limited resources, so they push these things, but at the same time, will they go in there and say, Yarimar has fewer papers, but the quality is great? I think they will, but will the Board of Scientific Council that evaluates me agree that this is important? Will my referees agree that this is important? So I think it becomes a bigger problem. That's why I think that one needs to have a change in the mindset of people about what the value of these things are.
Indeed. And seeing it as an opportunity to make some change. Brian, I wanted to ask you about pre-registration, which I think you pointed out that 66% of the articles that were the work that was pre-registered actually resulted in negative results, and then those papers were published, right? Because that was the deal. Do you see that as being something that would have broader applicability and potential?
Yes. So in the registered reports model, which is specifically linking pre-registration with the publication incentive, that's the 66%. The thousands more pre-registration happening without commitment to publishing yet, just for clarity there. But yeah, this has a very broad potential for application for any time someone thinks that they're actually testing a hypothesis. Right? So if you can make a pre-commitment of what you think will happen in the outcome of this research, whether you have competing hypotheses or you have a directional hypothesis, pre-registration is a very functional way to advance your confidence in the statistical inferences or the ultimate inferences you make from that process. That doesn't say that confirmatory research or hypothesis testing research is more important than exploratory discovery science. What it does is it helps distinguish when you're doing one versus the other. So in all of those studies where I pointed out the 66%, almost all of the papers also have an exploratory analysis section that follows and says, oh, maybe there was something weird about the design. Maybe there's things that we need to unpack here. Maybe there's other stuff. But then it's very clear this is post hoc. And so we won't have as much certainty in those results, but they may stimulate lots of ideas that then we can test as follow-up.
And so then the segue to you, Carrie, has NIH considered pre-registration for anything other than clinical trials, which obviously is a good example of pre-registration?
Yeah, I mean, certainly this is coming up in our discussions, not surprisingly, on animal research for exactly those reasons. I mean, I think it is a model that has been pointed to both to get at some of these, opportunities to crowdsource in some ways experimental design, but also in order to, from our kind of stewardship perspective, make sure that we are not sort of continuously funding the same, dead-end experiments over and over and over again, that we are, in fact, progressing science in a coordinated, transparent fashion. And that has both it has a fiduciary responsibility component, but regardless of whether you're talking about human beings or animals or cells that might be of limited quality, there's an ethical component as well that I think we feel pretty strongly about.
Great, thank you. And Arturo, actually hearkening back to Merton's norms of science, and how there's an implication here that science has gone awry somehow for a variety of factors. So when you looked at you said you had a 10% retraction rate for the studies that you looked at. Did you, or would you consider looking to see what the retraction rate was before, a certain time period, wherever you started? I can't remember exactly, 1991, because that actually is available in PubMed. You can actually see how many and what percentage that is.
So we have actually looked into that. In fact, my most cited paper shows that the majority of retractions are due to misconduct, but retractions that really have taken up exponentially. And it in a way is a good thing, in a way it's a symptom of the problem. But I think the important thing is that we need to sympathize with scientists who have to retract papers and realize that oftentimes many papers have 20 authors. The retraction is caused by one author. Try to find mechanisms not to stigmatize that and to encourage it in some ways. Mm-hmm. And if there is a problem with it, repeat the study or republish it again.
Right. Okay, great. Do any of the panelists have questions of the other panelists before we turn to the audience? Yarimar?
To Arturo, so, again, thinking from the tenure track perspective, you mentioned a lot of things that I think are great when you're an established scientist. You can call out people, you can, but when you are trying to establish a reputation, one of the things you have to consider is, am I going to be labeled as a difficult reviewer that is always preventing the big name people from publishing? And that will be important, because if I'm labeled like that, then I will not be asked anymore. And then that affects my reputation, and maybe they'll even know that I was the troublemaker, right? And the same thing for the both in the reviewing, but also publicly calling out someone is just not easy, because it can be career suicide for younger investigators to bring up these issues. And I think that there's so much of this club of people in science, that will people even call out their colleagues. So it's in an ideal world, this is what we should be doing, but I wonder about, in reality, what the concerns about retaliation and the effects on the career of the younger people. What do you think about that? So I think
from the point of view of journals and reviewing, you don't have to worry about that. I can tell you that what we value is rigorous review. And if you do a rigorous review, the journal editors will know you, and they don't associate, Yarimar with trashing a high lab or anything. They really focus on what you write. So
do you think this is for all journals or society journals?
Well, I think it's for all journals. Yeah, I've been an editor of several journals. I'm editor-in-chief now. What you really value is what they're telling you, and your reputation is made by the words in your review. That you don't have to worry. In terms of going out there and criticizing, I think that we always need to be very careful, because we don't often have all the facts. But the way that we have done it, Ferric Fang and I, and believe me, even though I was established scientist, people say to us, don't go there, because this is not the kind of thing you want to be known for is we have always gone the route of getting data and publishing it. And publishing in peer-reviewed journals, and then talking about it. We haven't gone out there and basically given a news conference or criticized people in a blog or anything. And that at least provides some degree of protection that you can go, because you're working within the system. So my suggestion is to work within the system, fix the system from within. That is, the revolutions can be made much more lasting and powerful if you do them from within, rather than attack from the outside.
I just add, though, that I think, Jaromir, you've brought up something that is another sort of cultural touchstone in science that is really important, because just your perception that might be a problem is itself a reality, right? Because it drives your behavior and how you think about things. Even hearing, I mean, this gets a little bit to the, the notion of sort of culture versus practice that Brian pointed out. And this is something I see as a common element in a lot of different issues. I mean, this may seem like an odd segue, but I'm dealing a lot with sexual harassment in science right now, as is the academy. And this is the exact same issue. People are loath to call out bad behaviors in a culture that really values reputation and prestige in some ways above all else. And that is a fundamental problem, because even if it's not the reality, as I think a lot of the editors and journal folks in the room just pointed out, the perception that it's a reality is enough to drive people's behavior and sort of maintain that culture of fear to say something or call out bad behavior. And that is something that we need to kind of collectively wrestle with.
So the someone mentioned it's not necessarily bad behavior, right? If we take the stigma out of it, it's just a matter of being able to say this experiment needs some other controls, or the statistics are not right, and not take it as a personal offense or.
Okay, well, you've all been waiting patiently out here, so we'll start here. Please go ahead. Please say your name and your affiliation, and then ask your question.
Richard Sever, Cold Spring Harbor Lab and BioArchive. So I had a question about this, the root cause that Alexa mentioned of the drift from the Mertonian norms. So we have a situation right now where when you start a PhD, you've got about a 5% chance of getting a tenured faculty position ultimately. So the competition for faculty places is far more severe than it's ever been. The number of faculty positions has remained pretty much constant for decades. The number of PhD students has shot up and up. Meanwhile, the grant award pay lines are going down and down and down. So what this has created is an incredibly a competitive environment, and that people are competing at a time in their lives where if they were in any other industry, they would have some level of job security, which they don't because they're not yet tenured. And then we're surprised that they're not open and transparent. So I guess the question is, are we at a point where the academic career structure, which was established decades ago when things were very, very different, is now actively blocking transparency, openness, and the way we go forward? This is why people are worried about, both of you mentioned high-impact journals. People are absolutely obsessed with this because they see these as the proxies that must be used to get to the top of an incredibly narrow pyramid. And it seems to me like that's an incredible force for the drift from the norms to the counter norms.
So Richard, you hit it right in the head. I think that in terms of graduate education, we need to let people know that we need scientists throughout all levels of society. There is only one PhD down the street in Congress, in 535 members of Congress. That body will be a lot different if you had 30 or 40 PhDs on it. So I think that I would address that by it. The second issue that you mentioned is this problem, this impact factor disease. It's important to realize that despite universal acknowledgement that it is a problem, it doesn't go away because it is maintained by scientists themselves. Once you break into the system, you're invested in the system. And I would say to you that until a large number of the prominent scientists decide to do something about it, this will not change. When I was a graduate student, I once asked my mentor, how do you choose a journal? He couldn't pronounce my first name, so he used to call me Art. He says, Art, come over here. We used to get three journals in the lab, and he said, open it up. You see these names here? These are the editors. You want your name associated with these people. This is how you choose a journal, based on the editors. I went off to do my residency, and then 10 years later, I'm in an immunology lab, and the world has changed. So how do you choose a journal? You look at the impact factor. I said, what kind of craziness is this? But that's exactly what works, because the people judging you are using that because it also works for them. So I would say to you that if we want to change this, you will need to get maybe 100 prominent scientists in the biomedical scientists to agree to do something about it. But until that gets done, you can write, I've written many editorials, many papers, you can do as many studies. Fundamentally, it's the scientists themselves.
I guess I would agree. I would just say that there was an effort and has resulted in some good things in the Public Library of Science, for example. That came from scientists. And so maybe there are some alternatives that we can look at as a scientific community without torpedoing anyone's career. So thank you for that question. Yes?
When you're talking about when you initially thought that, the difference then was that the consequences of not getting in that super high impact journal were different. It's not so acute. We wouldn't care about any of this if the consequences for failure weren't so severe, which was not having a job when you're 38.
Yeah, I think that's the key point, is that the level of competition doesn't change the fundamentals, it just amplifies the role of the incentives. And that's what's really pervasive and destructive. And it can get, I think Arturo's position on that one is too pessimistic, because it's not going to happen to change that overall structure. There isn't a path easily for that to happen. The change mechanisms in this context is to accept temporarily the reality of where the incentives are and change what behaviors are required to get those outcomes. So people are going to want the one-word journals for the foreseeable future. We may be able to change that on some grand scale eventually, but the near-term changes have to be, what does it take to get into them? And if you can start to implement rules of rigor that both the journals implement, right? We expect pre-registration. We expect transparency of all of these things. And that actually has consequence for how people evaluate what gets into the journal. And then the other agents are also participating in that. We're going to read 3 papers rather than just count how many papers you have in Science and Nature and Cell for your review. That's where you'll start to loosen the grip of the singular outcome that people want to a more diversified outcome.
I mean, I'm sorry if I came off pessimistic. I am not. In fact, I'll tell you a couple of examples in which things can be changed. But I would argue that the current system would make sense if the best science is in fact published in those journals.
Yes.
and the data is that they're not. A higher retraction rate than other papers, too clean, irreproducible, I mean, you name it. So the problem is sociological. Yeah. It's the sociology of science we need to do it. But let me give you some examples how you can change things. I am a department chair, and when I went to Hopkins 5 years ago, we decided to hire new people. I told the committee that they could not stratify CVs based on the impact of the papers. They had to present the content. We ended up hiring people that were very different in that case. So the committee basically said, we should interview this person because in this paper they did this. And where it got published became much secondary to what they actually did. Another example where I think I made a difference is I'm in the Scientific Council of the Pasteur Institute. Europe is crazy with impact factors. So going there 4 times a year and arguing that we need to judge science based on its quality, its content, it's made a difference. And I think that we are beginning to see that the discussions are different. But you need to fight the battle. And you need to get people to fight the battle with promotions committees. You need to fight it at multiple levels, and then change is possible. One individual can't do it.
Are you doing that with the tenure process as
Well, I can tell you that in our university, the tenure and promotions committee wanted the CVs to include the impact factor. And I went to the dean and the other chair and said, why? I mean, stop it. And we stopped it. But that's a battle that has to be fought every day because the system is very much built into it, and it's a sociopathology. That's what it is, a disease in it. And but it is possible to make change. And I would say that everyone in this room, if you push a little bit in your area, this will have an effect.
I was just going to say exactly the same thing. This is, a call to each of you, wherever you are in your organizations.
You can make a difference.
You can make a difference, yes. Please.
Thank you very much. I'm Harvey Feinberg, Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation. This has been a wonderfully stimulating and informative opening panel. Just one quick comment, Arturo, you may be interested. When I was supervising our review, promotions, and tenure committees, I would always explain at the outset that I already knew that they could count. The question in my mind was whether they could read. And it had a very salutary effect on leading people to actually look at what were the ideas and the future concepts, not simply numbers or certainly not impact factors.
So I invite you to write an editorial in our journal called "Please Read, Don't Count."
Or maybe reading will count.
Reading will count. Yes.
Okay, we'll work on the title together.
Yeah.
Okay, so I have just some very quick questions because each of you was so stimulating. Yarimar, I'm very interested. If you were in charge, which I am confident someday you will be, but if you were in charge today, what is the first thing that you would work to change, if you could do it? And I'll just ask the quick questions, and then the panel could say.
The tenure process. I'd like to see I'd like to see that all the tenure or promotion aspects are not based on the counting and that people actually see the impact that you have in the scientific community and your field based on the work that you did and the quality of the work, not just the...
So furthering exactly this discussion, perfect. If I could just go very quickly, Brian, you laid out if I followed correctly, two really important concepts. One was the need for, if you will, coordination, the problem of multiple actors having an impact on the ultimate result, and then the hierarchy from the foundation of the pyramid all the way up to the policy. My question to you to reflect on is where do you start? And because you can't necessarily do everything at the same time.
Yeah, that's a great question. And the pyramid implies you start at the bottom, but that's not the right answer, right? It's a coordinated effort across them. The ones at the top won't succeed without the ones at the bottom, but they're all sort of happening in a dynamism. Really, it's like any diffusion of technology innovations. Establish a beachhead. Where is there a small world community where you can actually have an impact, right? So small funders of very narrow diseases know their community and can have a big impact on that community. And so you can start with that community, get some alignment, change the practice there, and then incrementally expand from there. And so that's how we work on it.
Arturo, I was fascinated, your comment, Elizabeth Bick, you said in passing, is a housewife. I was wishing she had gone into radiology. Her eye is incredible.
Yeah, she's incredible.
My question to you, though, is given all the advances in machine learning, artificial intelligence, image recognition, do you know of any existing or in the works efforts to automate this kind of review, both for the edification of the authors who can avoid these correctable errors and for the purpose of...
So there are many companies who are trying to do this. In fact, I can tell you that people have asked for databases to train the machines.
Okay.
And they don't even need our databases. They can go to PubPeer and just spend one day in PubPeer and downloading off of it. There is a problem, though, and that is that unless you change the culture, it is too easy to continue to do this. You can defeat the machine by just basically stretching a figure a little bit and putting the computer power to compute a non-stretched figure. You just get it out of a hand.
So it won't correct the intentional problem, but it might help those.
It may help with the errors.
For the error.
Absolutely. The people who imported the wrong figure or accidentally mirrored them or something like that.
And finally, Carrie, I urge you to continue in that wonderful direction of talking about rigor and transparency. And the reason I say that is twofold. One, those are both in the control of the investigator. The investigator can conduct the research with rigor. The investigator can assure the transparency of materials, methods, code, data, etc. The other concepts are follow-on concepts that may or may not follow, but if you keep the focus on the things that the investigator can control, I think you're going to get ahead of the game, and I would urge you to continue in that direction.
Thank you very much. My name is Jenny Heinberg, and I'm a staff officer here at the National Academies. I have a quick comment and then a question, or maybe it's more of a, well, it's a question. I'll call it a question. First is there is a journal called Jove that goes out and videotapes life sciences and biology and chemists actually doing the methods that are reported in the papers. It's a way of increasing transparency and explanations that so scientists don't have to write down every single detail and maybe miss something critical, but might be easily seen in a video. So I just put that forward as an idea. And then the other is I worked with Harvey on the reproducibility report, and another committee member on there, Lorena Barba, does a lot of work on computational reproducibility, and she identifies two particular programs that are just wrought with problems for computational reproducibility. One of them is Excel, and the other, which we all probably know or hate at different levels, and the other are images, and the programs that allow for processing of images. And so you can put an image out that's been processed in different ways that looks very different or difficult to reproduce, either in your lab or other researchers to reproduce those same results. And so I guess in addition to just looking for exactly the same, but in an effort to become more transparent and reproducible, computationally reproducible, are there efforts are true that
So there are. I mean, I think that what you're seeing is the emergence of defense in depth. That no single thing is going to make the literature or science robust. That what we need to do is we need to deal from education. We have changed our PhD program, but some of we initiated a new PhD program at Hopkins. How do you know what you know? Logical errors, things like that, to software. And we need to encourage the robustness of the enterprise. And that is, and most people, it's like six blind people examining an elephant. Well, it's the impact factor, it's the review committees, it's the lack of funding. No, we got to think about making it more robust. And the two things that you mentioned are actually very important. I have several papers in Job. It's actually a pain to publish in Job. They because they demand things that you don't even think of putting into a paper. But, you can go to our papers in Job, you can click on it, you can see the graduate students doing the experiment. You may be able, that may be then again, Job won't get you promoted. Okay.
I want to add that one of my examples of success is precisely because of a Job, I don't know how to say that, paper. It made everything so that we got it done in one day. It was so easy, very helpful. So we use that journal a lot. But yes, no, it doesn't quite give you the recognition.
Right. Job, yeah. And to add to the culture part, we need to work on the scientists who don't think that is a publication or who call Job a predatory journal, because the fact is they contact you after you publish a paper. Of course they're going to contact you after they publish a paper. And they do charge money to publish. But you see, I mean, you have the sociological element, we need to work in all of them if we're going to make a difference.
Thank you.
So really terrific panel. Oh, Tom Kern, Children's Mercy, Kansas City. Wonderful discussion. Very quick comments for each of you, but I'll give all of the comments and let you digest. Jaromir, don't stop what you're doing. You're doing all the right things. 50 years ago, it was also the right things, and it was just as much underappreciated back then. You need to balance the methodology papers with the application papers. In the old days, it was methods and enzymology we used. I'm actually now negotiating the first publication in Jove. What a pain.
Good luck.
It is going to change things, and so we need to embrace that change. I have worked in developing some of the models in pain that you may be using, the molecular models. Let's talk offline. Happy to discuss. Brian, I'm really keen on seeing what comes out of your cancer reproducibility study. I'd love to share observations on a component of the cancer field with you to see if there are commonalities across there. Arturo, congratulations on the leadership by JCI. Always was a very rigorous publication process, took forever, but you've taken it to another level. Concerning the single-letter journals, also known as the tabloid journals, I've published lots in there as well. Not only is it hard to get in, it's very hard to get out. I've seen little appetite, and I've approached all of them in different ways for different papers to correct the historical literature. There's no interest in doing it as far as I can tell. Until we take that on, it's very hard to have better standards moving forward. Carrie, here's my problem with the NIH. Well, one of my problems with the NIH. There is a history of supporting data acquisition studies, and I was involved in one, an image acquisition study. Great database. 2 years after the study was complete, NIH shut down the website that shared the images because they couldn't afford to keep it going. The sustainability issue is a great concern to me with all the initiatives going on. But wonderful discussions.
Yeah, I would agree that is a problem with the NIH, and one of which we are keenly aware, and it does get back to this notion of recognizing that sort of infrastructure, that the the tools needed to facilitate sharing, transparency, interoperability are part of the science. They are not in opposition to the science. It's not it shouldn't be a priority decision of do I fund more experiments versus the ability to curate or store data. It should all be considered as part and parcel of science, and we should make scientific priorities, but it shouldn't be pitting the infrastructure pieces against the sort of experimental pieces. It's not helpful. So we're thinking a lot about sustainability for those very reasons.
Thank you.
Hi, Gunnar Rajagopal, excellent panel. I am leading the effort in target biology at Janssen R&D. And in my efforts, right, we have this challenge of reproducibility and all that. And you can take this problem two ways. One is, the scientists just point fingers and say this publication is nonsense and it's a waste of time. But what we've decided to do, and not only we, but our pharmaceutical colleagues, right, have shown that, we can contact the scientists and say, look, let's engage, let's find out exactly what you did. And to a large percentage of the cases, they actually are very, very keen for us to participate. We actually fund the experiments. I actually send people there for 2-3 months sometimes to reproduce this data. And a large fraction of them actually turn out to be correct. And the good thing out of this is that, we build trust and confidence on colleagues who will help us in really understanding the problem as we move forward, right? And the other thing, of course, is that, it turns a negative into a positive. And it works for everybody. So, people are highlighting problems, right? But this is a solution that's worked. The question, Arturo, is that once when we look at these papers, and many people may say this is not validated properly and all that, right? We actually spend the resources, do that, and we show that actually it works and it's correct, right? But then we keep the information internally.
Right. I would urge you to find a way to get your experience out into the peer review system, because you're learning a lot, but it's staying internally. And we, in a way, need to learn. The people who sounded the alarm originally 10 years ago, the name escapes me. They actually came from a company. They said, well, we can't publish this stuff because it's confidential. But there could have been ways in which it got out. And we owe them a terrific gratitude because they alerted us to a problem. You're basically laying out a solution. That the problem is a lot of details are not there. which is what Brian was saying on his second slide. But the problem is you can't often get all the details. You need to, it's the Eppendorf that is open too long, so that the oxygen breaks down the...
So our challenge is we have a sickness called lawyers, So we have our lawyers who are very worried about, we're going to lose intellectual property. And we have your lawyers in the academia who say, we are going to lose intellectual property again. There's some kind of mechanism that has to be put in place by the journals to actually help address this question.
No, I completely agree.
Thank you.
Thank you.
My name is Angela Abotu, and I'm from AdGene. And my question is primarily for Carrie. So I'm really glad to hear that the NIH is drafting a policy for responsible data sharing and that you're also thinking about animal research. But what about biological materials? In the life sciences field, materials like plasmids, antibodies, cell lines are commonly used to create data in the first place. And many journals have established material sharing recommendations, but my question is, what is being done by the NIH at the level of policies to promote responsible sharing and reporting of biological materials?
Yeah, that's a great question. So biological materials have been part of our rigor conversations more generally, more on the validation side in many ways, and looking at sources of biological material. But we think about this in our sort of broader conversations about sharing beyond just data and into things like biospecimens and other biological material. So it is not something we are ignoring. It's more just thinking, how all these pieces fit together. Part of it, I think, is this policy driver of kind of cultural norms. So as we tackle these things kind of piece by piece, how do we begin to move the needle on that cultural shift so that everything sort of falls under that umbrella of the culture of sharing and transparency in a way that is helpful to the science. So, yeah, thank you.
Hi, Steve Goodman, Stanford. So this was absolutely fantastic, and my comment is going to bookend with Harvey's initial comment. The reason we started moving towards impact factors and looking at numbers was an effort to move away from sort of the old boys network and look at some sort of objective assessment of quality as judged by the community. Of course, that has fallen apart as we begin to realize how the system is gamed, and that's not a good surrogate. The solution, as you said, and I have to confess, I had this experience at Stanford where I wrote the Stanford promotion letter for somebody. This is embarrassing. And it was rejected. It was sent back to me and said, you can't mention anything about the number of publications. You can't mention anything about the first authors. They made me take every single thing out. This is to their credit, I will say. Yeah. We only want 1 or 2 analyzed in detail. Yeah. And that was the first time I'd ever had my promotion letter for someone else rejected and sent back for revision. But it was a symbol of hope. But here's my question. If we go to this others, as we start to migrate to a system where we're really assessing the quality of the best as opposed to the quantity sometimes of the not so best, do we have two things? Do we have a consensus on what quality is? And how do we reduce the impact of just a few select people doing this evaluation? Because we're not going to get a community of 10 or 20 scientists in the field diving deep into those papers. In fact, it may just be one person who chooses one paper who weighs in on that and one on another. So this issue of how we assess quality and how we do it in a reasonably efficient way and in a way that's not idiosyncratic is my question to you or anybody else who wants to respond.
So I commend whoever made you change. I am also, in many ways, working to change this. I have, in our promotion system, and when I solicit, I said, I will strike out any sentences that said the person published in this. Because why? What exactly are you telling me? Tell me the other thing. I can tell you that fighting this battle, the secretary at the Pasteur Institute now word searches all the documents for the word impact. because they know that if you come to me, I will protest. And it will be taken out, and it changes the way people, but you're absolutely right. Any measure that you come out will be gamed, period. And any measure, single measure, is vulnerable to, in this case, to a testimonial, to bias or whatever. We need to put in place more robust mechanisms. And what you alluded to is you asked the question, how do we assess quality? How do we assess rigor? To me, those are scientific questions. These are fields that need to emerge. And there may be a time in which I can give somebody 2 papers and say, tell me which one is higher quality based on the work that was done. Know your opinion. Did you validate the thing by an independent way? How many times was the experiment done? All those variables can go into it. And you could then create a culture of rigor that moves away from the culture of impact.
I agree. We already have a gigantic experiment going on just by looking at the differences in peer reviewers on individual papers. And we know that they can differ wildly and widely. So this is really a central question.
Over here.
Hi, Valda Vincent from Science. So just have to speak up for the single name journals here. And say that we're very excited to be part of this process. The integrity of what we publish is the most important thing to us. I'm really glad that people are looking at changing the metrics for deciding tenure and hiring, because certainly we never wanted to set ourselves up as the arbiters of that kind of decision. So we, I think, are being misused in those kind of cases. But what I wanted to, the question I had now, I was very concerned to hear the comment that we are not concerned with correcting the historic record. So I'd like to know what those examples are. I would say that we do run into difficulty because we set standards at certain times. So, for example, I think it was 2016, we set new data standards. But then we get sort of questions coming in about papers that were prior to standards that we had in place, judging them by our current standards. And so we find ourselves in a difficult position then because, we had no rule against splicing back in 2008, I think, sort of right after people started using digital. So that and the other difficult position we're in is that journals actually do not investigate. We can look, we can say, yes, we agree, there is likely a problem here. We can go to the author and try and negotiate a correction, but if it actually involves an investigation, we refer it to the institution. And institutions can do a lot of delaying tactics, it feels like sometimes. But maybe they're just in the same position we are, of sort of being in a situation where it's a difficult situation. So I just want to say, it's not like we're sitting there going, oh, God, someone's questioned a paper. It really, we take it very seriously, and the integrity of our research is very important to us, and the more that we can put in place to ensure that, the happier we are. So.
Thank you very much for that comment. Well, this will be the last question, so please.
A single name journal weighing in. So I'm Malcolm McLeod from Edinburgh, so I'm not from round here, and it may be different here. But we've heard around image manipulation that someone, presumably as a kind of hobby, looked at 20,000 images to work out what was what, and people have done the same with sequences of primers, and we do the same looking at the Alzheimer's literature with 20,000 papers. There's a mismatch between the words that come out of the people who say they want to improve science and the extent to which they're prepared to pay for the checking and the hard work and the human endeavour that's required to go into ensuring that quality, because it will not happen automatically. And there is this belief, and I've got this delusional system as well in my head, that if only we could tweak the incentive system, then people will get better by themselves and it won't cost us anything. And I don't think that's true.
So you're absolutely right. You need to hire people to do this work at the journals level. And if you want to have that, you're going to have to pay for higher journal publishing fees. These things are very expensive, and they're even more expensive once an error is published. The amount of time that it takes to correct it.
Okay.
I agree very much with sort of the principle you've articulated, because I agree it is not enough to sort of, take a high-minded principle and say, go off and do good work. It is the recognition of what are the practical realities of implementing that principle, and then thinking that through in a very real and holistic way. So, speaking from the funding agency point of view, to give another very clear example in the rigor space, so we could move towards a hard policy that in animal studies, you have to meet a certain standard of statistical analysis, which might very well end up with, say, non-human primate studies with a lot more non-human primates in them, right? I mean, that's sort of the practical reality of a well-designed non-human primate study. And that is not a cost-free endeavor. And so then our thinking has to be, okay, well, if we move in that direction, we have a fixed amount of money. What does that mean for the entire pool? It could mean instead of doing 100 non-human primate studies with not enough animals, now we're doing 20 non-human studies with the appropriately powered number of animals. And now suddenly we're having this conversation with the entire community and Congress about the number of grants that we're giving out, right? So it is this kind of, again, ecosystem perspective where we have to think through, are we willing to pay for the values that we are espousing, and what are the sort of downstream consequences? Because at the end of the day, it is all about trade-offs. It's trade-offs in time, it's trade-offs in burden, it's trade-offs in money, it's trade-off in the way all of us do business, and we need to think through that equation in a very sort of full way. I, being the person who, wants to change the world, thinks I want to do the right thing and we should just pay for it. But fortunately or unfortunately, I don't have the spending authority at the agency, right? So this is a bigger conversation. But I think you're absolutely right, and we can't lose sight in any of these, because it is really easy to chase the ideals, but it is really hard to face sometimes the practical reality of what it takes to implement those ideals.
Thank you very much. And in spite of what you just said, I think everybody should go off and do good work. So on that note, thank you very much to the panelists and discussion.